All right, so that's sort of the basics. Let's just take a breath here for a second before we jump into the fun stuff. EEG and QEEG phenotypes, one of my favorite topics in all of this world. So there are 11 generally accepted phenotypes of the brain that can be discerned from specific features in the EEG. And this is to say that, these 11 categories are a minimum number of categories that describe the maximal amount of variance in the EEG. And that which isn't included in these phenotypes is generally either quote unquote normal EEG or quote unquote abnormal EEG. That becomes the abnormal and becomes a whole separate conversation. But phenotypes are, as described by Jay Gunkelman, the intermediate step between genetics and behavior. And I mean, that's really quite a statement to chew on when you consider our genetics and the way in which people interact with the world. This is really like a 300-page book that's yet to be written. A definition that has come out of my conversations with Jay regarding this is that phenotypes are the confluence of nature and nurture expressed in the psychophysiology of the brain. And even in that definition, I realized that like the behavior piece isn't quite as emphasized as I wish it was. So I'm going to continue to chew on that. But generally, it's a pretty good way to think about what we're talking about. These are semi-stable states in the neurophysiological function of the brain. There's a fantastic, really easy 3-page read, Transcend the DSM Using Phenotypes by Gunkelman. If any of you listening to this want to email me, I'd be happy to provide you with the paper. But you can find it for free on the internet as well. And another great paper by Johnston, Gunkelman, and Lunt in 2005. That's a fantastic resource that further describes what I'll be talking to you about further in today's conversation. So this year at Neurofield, there was a woman, Lexi Lenardicus, who gave a talk on ancestral voices singing through ancient brain structures. Found it absolutely fascinating and really just a riveting conversation, looking at this idea that the deeper we get into the older structures of the brain, the deeper we are going back into our genetic lineage. As a young teenager, maybe 15, 16 years old, I was exposed to the work of Joseph Campbell, a world religions expert who taught at Harvard. And I mean, this has been a huge passion project for me throughout my life. And I love to read about different religions and spiritual paths. As sort of a fun side project. And, something that I see in shamanism in particular, and that's lineages of North America and South and Central America, Africa, some South Asian, see it in Buddhism a little bit, and Taoism, is this welcoming of our ancestors as a really common occurrence in our lives, a really positive force. And in the world of psychology today, there's so much emphasis on transgenerational trauma. And while it's a really very real thing, and Lexi's talk speaks to that in great detail, I think it's kind of scapegoating that we just want to hang our trauma on our ancestors and not welcome forward, all of the gifts that our lineages bring into the room with us all the time. So just something to consider. And if those of you who are listening to this feel called to explore this, please, again, reach out to me. I'd love to talk about it further. And considering that the limbic system is considerably older than the cortex, what does this imply? How many of you would agree with the following statements? In human beings, strong emotions decrease cortical activation. Well, strong emotions generally come from the limbic system. And, while this cortical model of the lobes of the brain is really attractive for us to play with, really a lot of those strong emotions come from the limbic system. And it's really much of the function of the cortex to keep this in check. Damage to the neocortex often leads to increased emotionality. If we were to ask Harry Karasidis about this, who's a neurologist and just spoke, talks a lot about concussion work. He's written a book, Concussionology. Harry and I, anyway, we'll just keep on. A little more to say about that. But the cortex usually provides inhibition and regulation of emotions rather than activation. This is a true statement. So, in looking at these 11 phenotypes, and here they are: low voltage fast, epileptiform, diffuse slow, focal abnormalities, mixed fast and slow, frontal lobe hyperperfusion. This is very common with the ADHD. It's also common with obsessive compulsive disorder, oppositional defiance. Sleep disorders are wrapped into this as well. There's a proposed 12th phenotype by Martijn Arns, circadian rhythm disruption. I think it still needs a little bit of vetting, but it seems promising. Excess temporal lobe, sorry about that. Excess alpha variance, not low voltage, spindling excess beta, persistent eyes open alpha. I'm not going to read all of these out, but these are generally the things that we see in the EEG. Epileptiform, transient spikes and waves, et cetera, et cetera. Something to consider: focal abnormalities. These are localized, and when you see specific localized dysfunction in the EEG, it's really a case where you're probably going to want to refer that to a neurologist and get an expert opinion on this, because something, whether it's ischemic, there's a blood flow issue, or there's some kind of blunt trauma to the brain, you would be well served to get a second and medical perspective on this before you go ahead and treat it. Don't be afraid to refer out and to work in collaboration. I work with Harry very closely. I really recommend doing so. So, frontal lobe hypoperfusion. This is what this looks like in the WIN-EEG spectral analysis. This is a different file than we looked at before, but quite similar. And you can see here that there's excess theta at the midline. You can see it frontally. There's even slower activity in the delta range. There's mu left and right. Pretty common feature for ADHD. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a bit. Here's what this looks like in the EEG. And you can see here that there's these waves. If each one of these boxes is a fifth of a second, boom, 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 boom. And here there's some more of this. And if we looked at this EEG, this client's full 10-minute recording, you see that this generally persisted throughout the bulk of the recording. And something we really need to consider when we deal with source localization is this in fact limbic, or is it coming from a thalamocortical rhythm? Is it cortical? Generally, Loretta is more useful for deeper brain structure things, but not just limited to that. But we really want to know, where is it coming from? And this is what this looks like in a flat map. You've seen this before. Here we are looking at, in the 95th percentile of excess theta. We can see here that there's alpha 1 and alpha 2. This is that mu rhythm that I've discussed. In relative power, it gets a little bit more distributed. But frontal lobe hypoperfusion is the, in fact, correct phenotypical name for this. And diffuse slow. Now we are looking at a brain that is, 2+ standard deviations, so in the 95th plus percentile for excess delta and excess theta. I mean, this looks somewhat plus or minus similar, not so much, to the one we were looking at before. But, when we look at this in the EEG, what we see is that hopefully you didn't need the red boxes to see these big, slow waves happening. And these don't generally persist, in this person's case, throughout the whole 10-minute recording. We see the EEG looks reasonably normal for good long runs, and then they have these events or transients where they let these big bursts go. Sort of an interesting thing, but I mean, this person has some pretty intense presentation, bizarre content, one might say. They speak in tongues periodically. They have a very deep orientation to their spiritual life. And, Tiff Thompson gives a talk about pediatric EEG that suggests, pediatric EEG is a fairly complex world, but that suggests that when somebody has had a trauma or an insult to the brain early in life, the brain often responds in its own dominant rhythms that are available, and those rhythms get stuck. So that would suggest that perhaps this person was somewhat stuck in a very early developmental process. This person also has had a seizure, has had a tumor in the brain that was removed. I did, in fact, refer this to Harry. We discussed it prior to treatment. And they're doing all right these days. Spindling excess beta. I mean, again, I hope I didn't really need the box, but for the sake of consistency, I used one in the presentation. But you can see here, you know, this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we're at about 20 hertz. You can see here that it really persists through this whole, here's some slow activity, but then we've got a burst of beta, and then it speeds up, and we've got some beta spindling. We have it over here, over here. I mean, it's really everywhere throughout this recording. And this is cortical in nature, generally speaks to over-arousal of the cortex. This person, in fact, suffers with deep depression. I think it's a very anxiety-driven depression where they're just overrun by the over-arousal of their brain. So here's what it looks like in the EEG, in the flat maps. We are looking at, you know, in the 15 to 20 hertz bin. You know, if we look this out, we're at about, you know, 1.3, so in the 70th percentile, plus or minus, maybe 80th percentile, maybe even deeper, really. For excess beta, we see it frontally. This is a pretty neurotypical presentation for beta spindling and depression. And for relative power, you know, they really are just sort of maxing out the scale in the 95th plus percentile. And, you know, for consistency through the deck, again, I just chose 1.96. We could have expanded that out to 3, and we would have seen, in fact, that this persisted a bit higher. Vigilance modeling. So stages of sleep and vigilance. When we talk about sleep, this comes from Demmin and Kleitman back in the 1950s. Stage 1 is really quite awake, generally, not always. Stage 2, here we're talking about sleep. Stage 3, deeper. Stage 4, even deeper. And when we speak about vigilance modeling, this comes from the work of Benton Roth in the 60s. And here we're looking at A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, and then a transition into stage 2 sleep. If we look at our sort of rest wakefulness stages of the brain, and sleep labs do in fact define stages based on brainwave activity. That is their primary criteria by which they evaluate this. And what we see is that if sleep is the yin of this perspective, then vigilance would most definitely be the yang. It's very common in current psychological language that we would talk about arousal. Most of us are familiar with that term, but it is in fact vigilance, the manner in which people trust or mistrust the environment, that really defines the way in which they interact with the world, per this perspective. And when we talk about alertness and sleep onset in stage A1, high occipital EEG power, dominant in the back of the head. Here we're looking at F3, this is frontal left, O1, posterior left, and we're talking about alpha being dominant in the back of the head. A2, alpha is seen both up front and in the back of the head, quite common. We also see this commonly with OCD and ODD in an eyes open condition. A3, some people don't really spend a lot of time in this state, but some do. And here the alpha is dominant up front, but we see it drop out in the back of the head. B1 is a desynchronized low amplitude EEG, and we're going to look at this here closer in just a moment. B2 and B3, we see the rise of excess theta and delta as the brain is moving closer and closer to sleep. And here in stage C, with the K complex, which actually comes from a specific wave that we see. If the person is really getting deep into drowsing and you knock on your desk, you'll see the elicitation of this particular wave seen here. And you know, now we see the emergence of sleep spindles. And this is where, in fact, sleep onset really begins. So when it comes to vigilance regulation, I mean, here we are looking at a case where, you know, the grass is often greener on people's own sides of the fence, or that's a pretty common perspective I see. You know, people with a rigid vigilance regulation tend to have this sort of like getting it done tempo to life. They tend to be really productive. They also don't sleep that well and don't sleep that much. And they sleep kind of shallowly. Physiological regulation, not my favorite term for this, but that's what Jay called it. So that's what we're going to use. And we start to see this, you know, pretty healthy oscillation, you know, out of A1, down into A2 into A3, back to A2, down to B1, and then a rise again, and then a fall again. And this sort of natural ebb and flow of things is consistent with a healthier regulation of this process. Folks with a labile regulation, often these are folks where, they put their head on the pillow and they're out, and they think that's pretty awesome. But there's something not like entirely healthy about being that surrendered to our environment. And, for me, this is really sort of philosophically a case where, people have an orientation to fate versus free will. These are sort of your free will folks, and these folks tend to have a bit more of a tendency to rely on fate in terms of what's going to have things work out. I'm not sure one's better than the other, but just something to chew on. And when we look at physiological regulation in an eyes closed condition, so here is a snip from Winnie EEG. Again, here are these sites: frontal, central temporal, parietal, occipital, and we can see here alpha's in the back of the head, and it's kind of doing its thing. And then we see the alpha drop out. And what's happening here is the reticular nuclei stops producing acetylcholine, and the thalamic rhythm drops out. But then it comes back, and we see alpha emerge again, persists along, and then it drops out again. And it comes back, sort of ebbs, comes back, ebbs. And this is, a fairly healthy regulation of this process. When we look at a low voltage fast EEG and or B1 vigilance regulation, this is a case where I almost used a question mark, and there's some debate in the literature. There are folks who maintain that it's always the same regardless of the presentation. I don't know that I buy that. I think that we have to look at these things in context. This is in fact a low voltage EEG that we looked at the beginning of my presentation. And if we look at this down in here, we can see that this is low voltage, it's desynchronized. There's not a tremendous amount of rhythmic activity. There's little bursts of things, but they're generally a bit faster. We look down here in the occipital region and we come along. There's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, that's about 20 hertz. We get in here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, closer to 25. And what we're looking at here is the autonomic nervous system overarousal affecting the HPA axis, which in turn affects the reticular activating system, speeds up the diffuse thalamic rejection and desynchronization of the alpha peaks due to the speeding up of the firing. This person is not on their way towards sleep. This person is chronically overaroused. One of the big takeaways here for the neurotherapy community is you really have to come back and read the EEG. You have to go back to basics and learn how to read the EEG. The maps are incredibly helpful at this whole process, but you don't want to just forego looking at it yourself. For members of the medical community, whether they be psychiatrists or neurologists, I would encourage you, please don't go out and spend a fortune on software and think you're going to figure this out on your own. It takes years and a lot of mentoring and study to really make sense of what you're looking at. If you are looking to partner with people, I would suggest that you find people in your local communities. And again, please feel my contact information is at the end of this. You can send me an email and I will do my best to connect you with resources that will help you with this process. So when we look at EEG and QEEG, phenotypes and vigilance modeling, this is really what we're looking at. And these stages I described, A1, alpha's in the back of the head, A2, alpha's everywhere, A3, alpha's up front but drops out in the back, B1, this desynchronized stage in the EEG. And again, is this person progressing towards sleep, or are they in some different version of overarousal? And again, this is the domain, this is the area where a QEEG technologist or diplomat, depending on semantics really and where they're at in their license, in their credentialing process, is really going to be of great service to you in making sense of this. People who are dominant in this A1 state tend to respond to antidepressants, thymoleptics. And as we cruise along here, there's this vertical line down here with a slow alpha peak frequency. These folks are going to respond to acetylcholine or norepinephrine, generally like an Adderall type responder. And some of these folks really are incredibly hyperactive. I mean, it's really counterintuitive that you would see somebody bouncing, like a cat on a hot tin roof, and then look at it and see that their alpha peak frequency is barely above 8 hertz. But when they're given appropriate medication, this will bring them back towards this line where they can in fact progress fluidly or with physiological regulation in both directions. These folks have a faster brain rate scale and tend to respond to GABA-based medications. This would include the low voltage fast EEG, as well, folks with a fast alpha peak frequency, and they need something that's going to help slow their brain down so it can be a bit more flexible. These folks who jump right into this, B1 state, B2 state, these folks are going to respond to a stimulant. As we move along here, something that was a little confusing to me in this model for a long time, and this comes directly out of Markine and Orange's paper on this topic, is that these red arrows indicate a blockage of flow from one state to another. That if somebody has gone into stage 2 sleep and there's the presence of sleep spindles, they will not move back into wakefulness if we were to knock on the table. And if somebody is down here in this B3 state and there's a lot of beta spindling at the vertex, this is a wakefulness drive. These folks generally will respond well to a medication like Belsomra. Again, I'm not credentialed to give medication prescriptions. I'm a QEEG person and consult on this work, but I mean, I look at the EEG and then present the research. Something around the SMR is that, often in the world of neurotherapy, and there's good research to support this, that training SMR helps improve sleep. Excuse me. But something that gets overlooked is that often, what we're seeing here is that SMR actually makes state more stable. And if we overtrain this, we can actually make somebody a bit more rigid in a wakeful state. So something to consider. And here we are looking at the phenotypes. I'm not going to read them all out, the EEG findings and medication selections. People with epileptiform EEG, really consider an anticonvulsant, diffuse slow, stimulant may work. With a focal abnormality, it doesn't stand to reason that a medication is going to be very effective because the issue is localized. It's not general. Again, you're going to want to get a neurologist to weigh in on what's going on. But generally, neurotherapy is going to be more fruitful here. Mixed fast and slow, again, an anticonvulsant. Excess temporal lobe alpha, perhaps a stimulant. Faster alpha, generally these folks tend to do better with, neurofeedback training, some alpha theta training, spindling excess beta. And often these folks will end up on an antidepressant, but the brain doesn't need to be any more aroused. So something that's going to help slow it down is going to be really helpful. Now we're looking at the neurotherapy implications. For epileptiform, often SMR is suggested. Inhibiting the low and higher frequencies, slow cortical potentials have been shown to be really helpful. As a QEEG credentialed neurotherapist and mentor, just because you know what it is, doesn't mean you're allowed to give it a diagnosis. That's a medical diagnosis. You need to refer this to a medical provider. It's outside the scope of your credential. Just because you know how to treat it doesn't mean you're allowed to treat it. You need sign off from a medical provider. Don't go here alone. You're not in your credential to treat this without proper supervision from a medical provider. Diffuse slow, focal abnormalities. And again, this is really going to be specialized based on what we see in the EEG. Frontal lobe disturbances, inhibiting the slow activity in the front. Sometimes beta can be used to, for a stronger effect. This is all in the Johnston 2005 paper. It's a fairly heady read, but for no matter what forms of neurotherapy people are providing, I would still encourage you, go back to basics. Even though the field has advanced so far, it's really worth your time to come back to the foundations that it's built on. And I think regardless of whether you're using S-Loretta or Z-scores, or any host of other neurotherapy implications, including direct or alternating current. Coming back to the basics and getting a sense of what are we hoping to accomplish and what are the tools available to help us get there is really a responsible step. Excess spindling beta, we're treating this, yes, with neurotherapy, but more often than not in my clinic with direct current to really calm the brain down. And we see really good results with that.